All right, welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Today, this afternoon, we'll actually be starting a new read, and this is going to be one of my favorite writers here, Discrimination and Disparities by Thomas Sowell. That's the new book we're going to start here. This is actually a book that was published this year, 2018, at the beginning of the year, and it had nothing but rave reviews, so that's why I've decided to dive right on into it. And like I said, since it's something that's been released this year, instead of just reading it by myself and doing a review of it, I'm going to actually go ahead and allow this to be as part of the series here of us performing some actual reads. So I have no idea what to expect, so I guess we'll just dive right on into it. Chapter 1, Disparities and Prerequisites. The fact that economic and other outcomes often differ greatly among individuals, groups, institutions, and nations poses questions to which many people give very different answers. At one end of a spectrum of explanations offered is the belief that those who have been less fortunate in their outcomes are genetically less capable. At the other end of the spectrum is the belief that those less fortunate are victims of other people who are more fortunate. In between, there are many other explanations offered. But whatever the particular explanation offered, there seems to be general agreement that the disparities found in the real world differ greatly from what might be expected by random chance. Yet the great disparities in outcomes found in economic and other endeavors need not be due to either comparable disparities in innate capabilities or comparable disparities in the way people are treated by other people. The disparities can also reflect the plain fact that success in many kinds of endeavors depends on prerequisites peculiar to each endeavor, and a relatively small difference in meeting those prerequisites can mean a very large difference in outcomes. Prerequisites and probabilities. When there is some endeavor with 5 prerequisites for success, then by definition the chances of success in that endeavor depend on the chances of having all 5 of those prerequisites simultaneously. Even if none of these prerequisites is rare, for example, if these prerequisites are all so common that chances are 2 out of 3 that any given person has any one of these 5 prerequisites, nevertheless the odds are against having all 5 of the prerequisites for success in that endeavor. When the chances of having any one of the 5 prerequisites are 2 out of 3, as in this example, the chance of having all 5 is 2/3 multiplied by itself 5 times. That works out to 32 over 243. That comes out to 32 243rds in this example, or about 1 out of 8. In other words, the chances of failure are about 7 out of 8. This is obviously a very skewed distribution of success, and nothing like a normal bell curve of distribution of outcomes that we might expect otherwise. What does this little exercise in arithmetic mean in the real world? One conclusion is that we should not expect success to be evenly or randomly distributed among individuals, groups, institutions, or nations in endeavors with multiple prerequisites, which is to say, most meaningful endeavors. And if these are indeed prerequisites, then having 4 out of 5 prerequisites means nothing, as far as successful outcomes are concerned. In other words, people with most of the prerequisites for success may nevertheless be utter failures. When a prerequisite that is missing is complex or simple, its absence can negate the effect of all the other prerequisites that are present. If you are illiterate, for example, all the other good qualities that you may have in abundance count for nothing in many, if not most, careers today. As late as 1950, more than 40% of the world's adult population were still illiterate. That included more than half of the adults in Asia and Africa. If you are not prepared to undergo the extended toil and sacrifice that some particular endeavor may require, then despite having all the native potential for great success in that endeavor, and with all the doors of opportunity wide open, you can nevertheless become an utter failure. Not all the prerequisites are necessarily within the sole control of the individual who has them or does not have them. Even extraordinary capacities in one or some of the prerequisites can mean nothing in the ultimate outcome of some endeavors. Back in the early 20th century, for example, Professor Louis M. Terman of Stanford University launched a research project that followed 1,470 people with IQs of 140 and above for more than half a century. Data on the careers of men in this group, from a time when full-time careers for women were less common, showed serious disparities even within this rare group, all of whom had IQs within the top 1%. Some of these men had highly successful careers, others had more modest achievements, and about 20% were clearly disappointments. Of 150 men in this less successful category, only 8 received a graduate degree, and dozens of them received only a high school diploma. A similar number of the most successful men in Terman's group received 98 graduate degrees, more than a tenfold disparity among men who were all in the top 1% in IQ. Meanwhile, 2 men who were tested in childhood and who failed to make the 140 IQ cutoff level later earned Nobel Prizes, as none of the men with IQs of 140 and above did. Clearly then, all the men in Terman's group had at least one prerequisite for that extraordinary achievement, namely a high enough IQ. And clearly there must have been other prerequisites that hundreds of these men with IQs in the top 1% did not have. As for factors behind the differences in educational and career outcomes with Terman's group, the biggest differentiating factor was in family backgrounds. Men with the most outstanding achievements came from middle-class and upper-class families and were raised in homes where there were many books. Half of their fathers were college graduates, at a time when that was far more rare than today. Among those men who were least successful, nearly 1/3 had a parent who had dropped out of school before the 8th grade. Even extraordinary IQs did not eliminate the need for other prerequisites. Sometimes what is missing may be simply someone to point an individual with great potential in the right direction. An internationally renowned scholar once mentioned at a social gathering that when he was a young man, he had not thought about going to college until someone else urged him to do so. Nor was he the only person of exceptional ability of whom that was true. The asterisk here indicates that he's referring to a distinguished economist Richard Rosett. Distinguished economist Richard Rosett was another example. Some other people, including people without his great abilities, would automatically apply to college if they came from particular social groups where that was the norm. But without that one person who urged him to seek higher education, this particular internationally renowned scholar might well have become a fine automobile mechanic or a worker in some other manual occupation, but not a world-class scholar. There may be more or less of an approximation of a normal bell curve as far as how many people have any particular prerequisite, and yet a very skewed distribution of success based on having all the prerequisites simultaneously. This is not only true in theory, empirical evidence suggests that it is true also in practice. In golf, for example, there is something of an approximation of a bell curve when it comes to the distribution of such examples of individual skills as the number of putts per round of golf, or driving distances off the tee. And yet there is a grossly skewed distribution of outcomes requiring a whole range of golf skills, namely winning Professional Golfers Association PGA tournaments. Most professional golfers have never won a single PGA tournament in their entire lives, while just 3 golfers, Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, and Tiger Woods, won more than 200 PGA tournaments between them. Moreover, there are similarly skewed distributions of peak achievement in baseball and tennis, among other endeavors. Given multiple prerequisites for human endeavors, we should not be surprised if economic or social advances are not evenly or randomly distributed among individuals, groups, institutions, or nations at any given time. Nor should we be surprised if the laggards in one century forge ahead in some later century, or if world leaders in one era become laggards in another era. When the gain or loss of just one prerequisite can turn failure into success or turn success into failure, it should not be surprising in a changing world if the leaders and laggards of one century or millennium exchange places in some later century or millennium. If the prerequisites themselves change over time, with the development of new kinds of endeavors, or if advances in human knowledge revolutionize existing endeavors, the chance of a particular pattern of success and failure becoming permanent may be greatly reduced. Perhaps the most revolutionary change in the evolution of human societies was the development of agriculture, within the last 10% of the existence of human species. Agriculture made possible the feeding of concentrated populations in cities, which in turn have been, and remain, the sources of most of the landmark scientific, technological, and other advances of the human race that we all call civilization. The earliest known civilizations arose in geographic settings with strikingly similar characteristics. These include river valleys subject to annual floodings, whether in ancient Mesopotamia in the valley of the Indus River, on the Indian subcontinent in ancient times, along the Nile in ancient Egypt, or in the Yellow River Valley in ancient China. Clearly, there were other prerequisites, since these particular combinations of things had not produced agriculture, or civilization is dependent on agriculture for most of the existence of the human species. Genetic characteristics peculiar to the races in these particular locations hardly seem likely to be the key factor, since the population of these areas are by no means in the forefront of human achievements today. Patterns of very skewed distributions of success have long been common in the real world, and such skewed outcomes contradict some fundamental assumptions on both the political left and right. People on opposite sides of many issues may both assume a background level of probabilities that is not realistic. Yet that flawed perception of probabilities and the failure of the real world to match expectations derived from that flawed perception can drive ideological movements, political crusades, and judicial decisions, up to and including decisions by the Supreme Court of the United States, where disparate impact statistics showing different outcomes for different groups have been enough to create a presumption of discrimination. In the past, similar statistical disparities were enough to promote genetic determinism, from which came eugenics, laws forbidding interracial marriages, and, where there were other prerequisites for monumental catastrophe, the Holocaust. In short, gross disparities among peoples in their economic outcomes, scientific discoveries, technological advances, and other achievements have inspired efforts at explanation that span the ideological spectrum. To subject these explanations to the test of facts, it may be useful to begin by examining some empirical evidence about disparities among individuals, social groups, institutions, and nations. Empirical evidence. Behind any attempts to explain and change glaring disparities in outcomes among human beings is the implicit assumption that such disparities would not exist without corresponding disparities in either people's genetic makeup or in the way they are treated by other people. These disparities exist both among individuals and among aggregations of people organized into institutions of various sorts, ranging from families to businesses to whole nations. Skewed distributions of outcomes are also common in nature, and outcomes over which humans have no control, ranging from lightning to earthquakes and tornadoes. People. While it might seem plausible that equal, or at least comparable outcomes would exist among people in various social groups, in the absence of some biased human intervention or some genetic differences affecting those people's outcomes, neither belief survives the test of empirical evidence. A study of national merit scholarship finalists, for example, found that among finalists from five child families, the firstborn was the finalist more often than the other four siblings combined. If there is not equality of outcomes among people born to the same parents and raised under the same roof, why should equality of outcomes be expected or assumed when conditions are not nearly so comparable? Firstborns were also a majority of the finalists in 2-child, 3-child, and 4-child families. Such results are a challenge to believers in either heredity or environment, as those terms are conventionally used. IQ data from Britain, Germany, and the United States showed that the average IQ of firstborn children was higher than the average IQ of their later-born siblings. Moreover, the average IQ of second-born children as a group was higher than the average IQ of third-born children. A similar pattern was found among young men given mental tests for military service in the Netherlands. The firstborn averaged higher mental test scores than their siblings, and the other siblings likewise averaged higher scores than those born after them. Similar results were found in mental test results for Norwegians. The sample sizes in these studies ranged into the hundreds of thousands. These advantages of the firstborn seem to carry over into later life in many fields. Data on male medical students at the University of Michigan class of 1968 showed that the proportion of firstborn men in that class was more than double the proportion of later-born men as a group, and more than 10 times the proportion among men who were fourth-born or later. A 1978 study of applicants to a medical school in New Jersey showed the firstborn overrepresented among the applicants, and still more so among the successful applicants. Most other countries do not have as high a proportion of their young people go on to a college or university education as in the United States. But whatever the proportion in a given country, the firstborn tend to go on to higher education more often than do later siblings. A study of Britons in 2003 showed that 22% of those who were the eldest child went on to receive a degree, compared to 11% of those who were the fourth child and 3% of those who were the 10th child. A study of more than 20,000 young people in late 20th century France showed that 18% of those males who were an only child completed 4 years of college, compared to 16% of male firstborn children, and just 7% of males who were fifth-born or later born. Among females, the disparity was slightly larger. 23% who were an only child completed 4 years of college, compared to 19% who were firstborn, and just 5% of those who were fifth-born or later. Birth order differences persist as people move into their careers. A study of about 4,000 Americans concluded that the decline in average earnings is even more pronounced than the decline in education between those born earlier and those born later. Other studies have shown the firstborn to be overrepresented among lawyers in the greater Boston area and among members of Congress. Of the 29 original astronauts in the Apollo program that put a man on the moon, 22 were either firstborn or an only child. The firstborn and the only child were also overrepresented among leading composers of classical music. Consider how many things are the same for children born to the same parents and raised under the same roof: race, the family gene pool, economic level, cultural values, educational opportunities, parents' educational and intellectual levels, as well as the family's relatives, neighbors, and friends. And yet the difference in birth order alone has made a demonstrable difference in outcomes. Whatever the general advantages or disadvantages the children in a particular family may have, the only obvious advantage that applies only to the firstborn or to any only child is the undivided attention of the parents during early childhood development. The fact that twins tend to average several points lower IQs than people born singly reinforces this inference. Conceivably, the lower average IQ of twins might have originated in the womb, but when one of the twins is stillborn or dies early, the surviving twin averages an IQ closer to that of people born singly. This suggests that with twins, as with other children, the divided or undivided attention of the parents may be key. In addition to quantitatively different amounts of parental attention available to children born earlier and later than their siblings, there are also qualitative differences in parental attention to children in general from one social class to another. Children of parents with professional occupations have been found to hear 2,100 words per hour, while children from working class families hear 1,200 words per hour, and children from families on welfare hear 600 words per hour. Other studies suggest that there are also qualitative differences in the manner of parent-child interactions in different social classes. Against this background, expectations or assumptions of equal or comparable outcomes from children raised in such different ways have no basis. Nor can different outcomes in schools, colleges, or employment be automatically attributed to those who teach, grade, or hire them, when empirical evidence shows that how people were raised can affect how they turn out as adults. It is not simply that they may have different levels of ability as adults. People from different social backgrounds may also have different goals and priorities, a possibility paid little or no attention in many studies that measure how much opportunity there is by how much upward movement takes place, as if everyone is equally striving to move up. Most notable achievements involve multiple factors, beginning with a desire to succeed in a particular endeavor, and a willingness to do what it takes without all the native ability in an individual and all the opportunity in a society mean nothing, just as the desire and the opportunity mean nothing without the ability. What this suggests, among other things, is that an individual, a people, or a nation may have some, many, or most of the prerequisites for a given achievement without having any real success in producing that achievement. And yet that individual, that people, or that nation may suddenly burst upon the scene with spectacular success when whatever the missing factor or factors are finally get added to the mix. Poor and backward nations that suddenly move to the forefront of human achievement include Scotland, beginning in the 18th century, and Japan, beginning in the 19th century. Both had rapid rises as time is measured in history. Scotland was for centuries one of the poorest, most economically and educationally lagging nations on the outer fringes of European civilization. There was said to be no 14th century Scottish baron who could write his own name. And yet, in the 18th and 19th centuries, a disproportionate number of the leading intellectual figures in Britain were of Scottish ancestry, including James Watt in engineering, Adam Smith in economics, David Hume in philosophy, Joseph Black in chemistry, Sir Walter Scott in literature, and James Mill and John Stuart Mill in economic and political writings. Among the changes that had occurred among the Scots was their Protestant church's crusade promoting the idea that everyone should learn to read so as to be able to read the Bible personally rather than have priests tell them what it says and means. Another change was a more secular but still fervent crusade to learn the English language, which replaced their native Gaelic among the Scottish lowlanders, and thereby opened up far more fields of written knowledge to the Scots. In some of those fields, including medicine and engineering, the Scots eventually excelled the English and became renowned internationally. These were mostly Scottish lowlanders rather than Highlanders who continued to speak Gaelic for generations longer. Japan was likewise poorly educated and technologically backward nation, as late as the middle of the 19th century. The Japanese were astonished to see a train for the first time, that train being presented to them by American Commodore Matthew Perry, whose ships visited Japan in 1853. Yet after later generations of extraordinary national efforts to catch up with the Western world technologically, these efforts led to Japan's being in the forefront of technology in a number of fields in the latter half of the 20th century. Among other things, Japan produced a bullet train that exceeded anything produced in the United States. Other extraordinary advances have been made by a particular people rather than by a nation-state. We have become so used to seeing numerous world-class performances by Jewish intellectual figures in the arts and sciences that it is necessary to note that this has been an achievement that burst upon the world as a widespread social phenomenon in the 19th and 20th centuries, even though there had been isolated Jewish intellectual figures of international stature in some earlier centuries. As a distinguished economic historian put it, despite their vast advantage in literacy and human capital for many centuries, Jews played an almost negligible role in the history of science and technology before and during the earlier Industrial Revolution, and the great advances in science and mathematics between 1600 and 1750 do not include work associated with Jewish names. Whatever the potentialities of Jews during the era of the Industrial Revolution, and despite their literacy and other human capital, there was often little opportunity for them to gain access to the institutions of the wider society in Europe, where the Industrial Revolution began. Jews were not admitted to most universities in Europe prior to the 19th century. Late in the 18th century, the United States became a pioneer in granting Jews the same legal rights as everyone else, as a result of the Constitution's general ban against federal laws that discriminate on the basis of religion. France followed suit after the Revolution of 1789, and other nations began easing or eliminating various bans on Jews in various times and places during the 19th century. In the wake of these developments, Jews began to flow and then to flood into universities. By the 1880s, for example, Jews were 30% of all the students at Vienna University. The net result in the late 19th century and in the 20th century was a relatively sudden proliferation of internationally renowned Jewish figures in many fields, including fields in which Jews were virtually non-existent among the leaders in early centuries. From 1870 to 1950, Jews were greatly overrepresented among prominent figures in the arts and sciences relative to their proportion of the population in various European countries and in the United States. In the second half of the 20th century, with Jews being less than 1% of the world's population, they received 22% of the Nobel Prizes in chemistry, 32% in medicine, and 32% in physics. Here, as in other very different contexts, changes in the extent to which prerequisites are met completely can have dramatic effects on outcomes in a relatively short time as history is measured. The fact that Jews rose dramatically in certain fields after various barriers were removed does not mean that other groups would do the same if barriers against them were removed, for the Jews already had various other prerequisites for such achievement, notably widespread literacy during centuries when illiteracy was the norm in the world at large, and Jews needed only enough additional prerequisites to complete the required ensemble. Conversely, China was for centuries the most technologically advanced nation in the world, especially during what were called the Middle Ages in Europe. The Chinese had cast iron 1,000 years before the Europeans. A Chinese admiral led a voyage of discovery that was longer than Columbus's voyage, generations before Columbus's voyage, and in ships far larger and technologically more advanced than Columbus's ships. One crucial decision in 15th century China, however, set in motion a radical change in the relative positions of the Chinese and Europeans. Like other nations demonstrably more advanced than others, the Chinese regarded those as others as innately inferior, as barbarians, just as the Romans likewise regarded peoples beyond the domain of the Roman Empire. Convinced by the exploratory voyages of its ships that there was nothing to be learned from other peoples and other places, the government of China decided in 1433 to not only discontinue such voyages, but to forbid such voyages, or the building of ships capable of making such voyages, and to greatly reduce the influence of the outside world on Chinese society. Plausible as this decision might have seemed at the time, it came as Europe was emerging from its Dark Ages of retrogression in the wake of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and was now experiencing a renaissance of progress in many ways, including progress based on developing things that had originated in China, such as printing and gunpowder. Columbus's ships, though not up to the standards of those once made in China, were sufficient to cross the Atlantic Ocean in search of a route to India, and to inadvertently make the world-changing discovery of a whole hemisphere. In short, Europe had expanding opportunities for progress, both within itself and in the larger world, opened up to it by its expansion into the other half of the planet, at a time when China's rulers had chosen the path of isolation, not total but substantial isolation. The straitjacket of isolation inflicted on many ports of the world by geographic barriers that left whole peoples and nations poor and backward was inflicted on China by its own rulers. The net result over the centuries that followed was that China fell behind in an era of great technological and economic progress elsewhere in the world. In the pitiless international jungle, this meant that other countries not only surpassed China, but imposed their will on a vulnerable China, which declined to the status of a third world country, partly subordinated to other countries in various ways, including a loss of territory as the Portuguese took over the port of Macau, the British took over the port of Hong Kong, and eventually Japan seized much territory on the mainland of China. What China lost were not the prerequisites represented by the qualities of its people, but the wisdom of its rulers who, with one crucial decision, the loss of just one prerequisite, forfeited the country's preeminence in the world. That the qualities of the Chinese people endured was evidenced by the worldwide success of millions of overseas Chinese immigrants who arrived in many countries in Southeast Asia and in the Western Hemisphere, often destitute and with little education, and yet rose over the generations to prosperity and in many individual cases even great wealth. The contrast between the fate of China and the fate of overseas Chinese was demonstrated when, as late as 1994, the 57 million overseas Chinese produced as much wealth as the billion people living in China. Among the more dire national projects that failed among other nations, fortunately in this case, for lack of one prerequisite, was the attempt by Nazi Germany to create a nuclear bomb. Hitler not only had such a program, he had it before the United States launched a similar program. Germany was, at that point, in the forefront of science and nuclear physics. However, it so happened that, at that particular juncture in history, many of the leading nuclear physicists in the world were Jewish, and Hitler's fanatical anti-Semitism not only precluded their participation in this nuclear bomb project, his threat to the survival of Jews in general led many of these physicists to leave Europe and immigrate to the United States. It was expatriated Jewish nuclear physicists who brought the threat of a Nazi nuclear bomb to President Roosevelt's attention and urged the creation of an American program to create such a bomb before the Nazis got one. Moreover, Jewish scientists, both expatriate and American, played a major role in the development of the American nuclear bomb. These scientists were a key resource that the United States had and that Hitler could not have as a result of his own racial fanaticism. The whole world escaped the prospect of mass annihilation and or crushing subjugation to Nazi oppression and dehumanization because Hitler's nuclear program lacked one key factor. He had some leading nuclear physicists, but not enough. All right, we're just about a little over a half hour, and I've been trying to keep these episodes to roughly half-hour reads. I guess that we're probably about halfway through that first chapter. Actually, we're pretty darn close to finishing this chapter, but that's okay. We'll stop there, and we'll finish another time with the rest of this chapter. I am in the middle of another read with another book. I won't say exactly which one that is because I don't know how these episodes are going to get laid out once I do get them uploaded, but we'll interject with some more more of Thomas Sowell's Discrimination and Disparities another time. Hopefully we can get at least one of these reads in a week, possibly two. So until the next time, this has been Mike from Mike Reads, signing off.